If you're over 60, what you do, or don't do, in the first hour after you wake up may matter more for your brain than anything you eat all day. A large research team out of Osaka University followed tens of thousands of adults for years, tracking every detail of their daily habits. And when they finally sat down with the numbers, one pattern stood out above everything else. People who skipped this one simple morning habit had an 18% higher risk of stroke than people who didn't. Not a guess. Not a theory. A published, peer-reviewed number sitting right there in the data. And by the end of this video you're going to know exactly what that habit is, why your blood vessels are especially vulnerable to it after 60, and the simple 2-minute fix that brings that risk back down. Every single claim in this video is pulled directly from published medical research. Real studies, real numbers, real citations. So stay with me because this is the kind of information that's genuinely worth 5 minutes of your morning. Before we get into the details, I want to ask you something because I read every single comment. How old are you? And be honest with me, do you eat breakfast every single day, or are there mornings where you just skip it and grab coffee instead? Type your age and your honest answer below. You'd be surprised how many people in this community are in the exact same boat, and it helps me know what to cover next. Now let's get into it. The mistake is skipping breakfast. I know how simple that sounds, and I know some of you are already thinking, that's it? That's the big mistake. But stick with me because the reason this matters so much after 60 has nothing to do with calories or weight. It has to do with what happens inside your arteries in the first 60 to 90 minutes after you wake up, and that mechanism is exactly what the research has been tracking. Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly. When you sleep through the night, your body goes many hours without food. That's completely normal. It happens every night for everyone, and it isn't the problem on its own. The problem is what happens the moment you wake up and your body has to decide what to do next. If you eat a proper breakfast, your blood sugar and blood pressure ease into the day in a controlled, gradual way. If you skip it, your body responds very differently, and after 60, that difference is no longer something your cardiovascular system can just shrug off the way it might have decades ago. This is also why this particular mistake is so easy to overlook. It doesn't feel dangerous in the moment. There's no pain, no warning sign, nothing that tells you anything is wrong. You just feel a little hungry, maybe a little tired, and you go about your morning. But researchers who've spent years studying cardiovascular events have found that this quiet, invisible habit leaves a very real fingerprint on long-term stroke risk. And that fingerprint shows up clearly once you follow enough people for long enough. Let's talk about where that 18% number actually comes from, because I don't want you taking my word for it, I want you to see the research yourself. The study was led by Dr. Yasuhiko Kubota and a research team at Osaka University Graduate School of Medicine in Japan. It was published in the American Heart Association's journal Stroke. The researchers wanted to answer a question that, surprisingly, almost no one had studied properly before. Does how often you eat breakfast actually change your risk of having a stroke or a cardiovascular event, separate from all the other lifestyle factors we normally hear about, like smoking or exercise? They followed a large group of adults from the general Japanese population and sorted them into categories based on how often they ate breakfast. Some ate it every single day, some ate it a few times a week, and some almost never ate it at all. Then they tracked these people over time and recorded every stroke, every cardiovascular event, every hospitalization that followed. When the results came in, the pattern was unmistakable. Compared to people who ate breakfast every day, the people who never ate breakfast had an 18% higher risk of total stroke. And it didn't stop there. When the researchers looked specifically at cerebral hemorrhage, bleeding inside the brain, one of the most dangerous stroke types there is, the risk for habitual breakfast skippers was 36% higher. Let that sink in for a second. 36%. That's not a small statistical wobble. That's one of the clearest lifestyle-to-stroke connections researchers have found in this population, and it's exactly why this particular study gets cited so often in later research on the topic. Here's the detail that made this study stand out to cardiologists around the world. The researchers adjusted for other risk factors. They accounted for smoking, for existing high blood pressure, for cholesterol, for body weight, for exercise habits. Even after removing all of those variables from the equation, breakfast skipping stayed independently linked to higher stroke risk. In other words, this wasn't just breakfast skippers happening to have other bad habits too, like smoking more or exercising less. The breakfast habit itself on its own was moving the needle. Interestingly, when this same research team looked at coronary heart disease specifically, heart attacks, they didn't find the same strong connection. The danger from skipping breakfast, according to this research, is concentrated much more heavily in the brain than in the heart. Which tells us something important. This isn't a general eat healthy message you've heard 100 times before. This is a very specific warning about a very specific organ, and that organ is the one every person over 60 worries about protecting the most. Now, why would something as simple as skipping breakfast have that much power over your risk of a brain bleed? Let's talk about what's actually happening inside your blood vessels while you sleep, and in the hour right after you open your eyes. Why mornings are the danger zone. There's a phenomenon doctors call the morning surge. Every single one of us experiences a natural rise in blood pressure in the early morning hours, usually somewhere between waking up and the first couple of hours of the day. This is completely normal. It's your body's way of getting your cardiovascular system ready to be upright and active after hours of lying still through the night. For most people, this surge is gentle. It rises, your body adjusts, and it levels off within a fairly narrow, manageable range. But research has shown that this exact window, the early morning surge, is when the majority of strokes and cardiovascular events actually happen. Not at night. Not in the afternoon. In the morning, in that first stretch after waking. And the researchers behind the breakfast study specifically pointed to this morning blood pressure spike as the likely mechanism connecting breakfast skipping to stroke risk. Here's the connection. When you skip breakfast, your body is already dealing with a longer stretch without food, without fluids in some cases, and without the gentle metabolic wake-up call that a meal provides. Your blood sugar, instead of rising steadily, can behave more erratically. Your blood vessels, instead of easing into the day, can experience a sharper, less controlled rise in pressure. For someone in their 30s or 40s, blood vessels are flexible enough to absorb that stress without much consequence. But after 60, your arteries have naturally lost some of that elasticity from decades of everyday wear. They're stiffer. They're less forgiving. A sharp morning pressure spike that a younger body could shrug off is a very different story for a blood vessel wall that's already been under that kind of pressure for years. This is why age isn't just a side detail in this conversation. It's the whole reason this research matters so much to this specific audience. The same habit that might be a minor inconvenience at 35 becomes a measurable stroke risk factor at 65, 70, and beyond, because the underlying vascular system is simply less resilient to that morning stress spike than it used to be. And this brain-specific vulnerability lines up with something else the researchers noted directly. They pointed out that the major risk factor for cerebral hemorrhage in particular is hypertension, and especially a sharp rise in blood pressure during the morning hours. That's not a coincidence. That's the exact mechanism connecting an empty stomach at 7 in the morning to a 36% higher risk of bleeding in the brain. A second study confirms it. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. One study, even a well-designed one, isn't proof of anything on its own. So let's look at what other research groups found when they studied the exact same question, in a completely different population, using a completely different research design. A separate research team published a large prospective study, meaning they tracked the same group of people over a very long stretch of time, in this case somewhere between 17 and 23 years, looking specifically at breakfast habits and cardiovascular mortality. This wasn't a small sample either. It drew on a nationally representative group, followed for nearly 2 decades, which is an enormous commitment of time and resources for a research team to carry out. Their conclusion lined up almost perfectly with the Osaka research. They found that skipping breakfast was significantly associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular death, and when they broke that number down further, the strongest signal was specifically for death related to stroke. Just like the first study, this connection held up even after the researchers controlled for demographic factors, income and lifestyle factors, diet quality, body weight, and other established cardiovascular risk factors. 2 completely separate research teams, 2 different time frames, 2 different populations, and the same conclusion kept surfacing. Breakfast skipping and stroke risk are connected, independent of nearly everything else researchers can measure. That same research review also pointed to earlier work following male health professionals in the United States, which found that men who regularly skipped breakfast had a 27% higher risk of developing coronary heart disease compared to men who ate breakfast. And a broader pooled analysis, combining data from multiple long-term studies covering nearly 200,000 adults, found that people who regularly skipped breakfast were roughly 21% more likely to develop or die from cardiovascular disease, with an even higher 32% increase in risk of death from any cause. When you start lining these numbers up side by side from completely different research teams, in completely different countries, the picture becomes very hard to dismiss as coincidence. And it doesn't end there. A newer analysis published just last year used a method called Mendelian randomization, a technique researchers use specifically to get closer to cause and effect, rather than just correlation, by looking at genetic data instead of relying purely on people's reported habits. That analysis found that breakfast skipping significantly increased the risk of coronary heart disease and heart attack at a genetic level, reinforcing that this isn't just an association driven by breakfast skippers happening to have other bad habits. There is a real, measurable, biological pathway connecting this one morning decision to what happens in your blood vessels years down the line. So we're not talking about one surprising headline from one single study. We're talking about a pattern that multiple independent research groups, using different methods, different countries, and different decades of data, keep landing on again and again. If you've made it this far, drop a comment that says breakfast, so I know you're taking this seriously, because what I want to walk you through next is exactly how to fix this starting tomorrow morning. The right way to do it. Here's the good news in all of this. Unlike a lot of health risks that feel complicated or expensive to address, this one has a genuinely simple fix, and it doesn't require a special diet, a supplement, or a single dollar spent on anything new. The first piece is timing. Based on how the research defines a proper breakfast pattern, the goal is to eat something within roughly 1 hour of waking up. You don't need a large meal. You don't need to cook anything elaborate. The point is to give your body that early signal. Food is here, you don't need to keep ramping stress hormones and blood pressure upward the way you would on an empty stomach. The second piece is what you eat, because not all breakfasts blunt that morning blood pressure surge equally well. A combination of protein and slow-digesting carbohydrates tends to work best. Something like eggs with a slice of whole-grain toast, or a bowl of oatmeal with a spoonful of nut butter stirred in, gives your body a steady stream of energy instead of a spike and crash pattern. Protein in particular helps stabilize blood sugar through the late morning, which keeps that whole cardiovascular system on a smoother, more predictable curve rather than the erratic pattern researchers linked to higher stroke risk. A sugary pastry or a plain cup of coffee on an empty stomach doesn't give your body that same steady support, so the composition of the meal matters almost as much as the timing. The third piece, and this one gets overlooked constantly, is hydration. A glass of water first thing before coffee, before anything else, helps support healthy blood volume and blood pressure regulation right as your body is coming out of that overnight fasting stretch. Coffee is fine. Nobody's telling you to give it up, but if coffee is the only thing hitting your system before 9 or 10 in the morning, you're doing the exact opposite of what your blood vessels need during that vulnerable morning window. And here's a small trick worth mentioning for anyone whose mornings genuinely feel rushed. If a full sit-down breakfast isn't realistic every single day, even something small, a hard-boiled egg, a handful of nuts, a piece of fruit with a bit of cheese, is enough to blunt that harsh morning transition. The research isn't asking for a gourmet meal. It's asking your body not to face that morning blood pressure surge completely unsupported, and even a small amount of food does far more for that than nothing at all. If you already eat breakfast every day genuinely, that's one less thing you need to worry about when it comes to this particular risk. But if today's video was the first time you've heard any of this, tomorrow morning is your chance to do something differently, and it costs you nothing but 5 extra minutes. Let's get specific for a moment, because vague advice like, eat a healthy breakfast, isn't very useful on its own. A few real examples that fit the protein plus low-carb pattern researchers point to: 2 eggs with a slice of whole-grain toast and half an avocado, plain Greek yogurt with a handful of berries and a spoonful of oats mixed in, a small bowl of oatmeal made with milk instead of water, topped with walnuts and a few slices of banana, or if you're truly short on time, a slice of whole-grain toast with natural peanut butter and a boiled egg on the side. None of these take more than 5 or 6 minutes to prepare, and all of them give your body the steady fuel it needs to ease into that morning blood pressure surge instead of facing it with nothing in your system. If you're someone who genuinely isn't hungry first thing in the morning, that's common, and it doesn't mean you're off the hook. Even a small amount of food, half a banana, a few almonds, a small glass of milk, is enough to blunt that harsh transition. The research isn't asking you to force down a large meal you don't want. It's asking your body not to face that morning surge on completely empty reserves, and building the habit slowly, starting with something small and light, tends to work far better long-term than forcing a big meal you don't actually want and abandoning the habit after a few days. Why this matters more as you get older. I want to come back to something for a second, because I think it's easy to hear 18% and 36%, and let those numbers wash over you without really absorbing what they mean. These aren't small print statistics buried in a footnote somewhere. These are numbers describing real people, tracked for years, whose single biggest daily habit difference was whether or not they ate in the morning. And the reason this channel keeps coming back to research like this is simple. After 60, your margin for error narrows. Your blood vessels have already been through decades of everyday wear. Your body doesn't bounce back from a sharp blood pressure spike the way it did at 30. That's not something to be afraid of, it's just biology, and biology responds well to small, consistent adjustments. The habit that protects you doesn't have to be dramatic. It just has to be consistent, and it has to start with the very first hour of your day, every single day, not just once in a while. That's really the heart of what all of these research teams found, from Osaka to the long-running cardiovascular cohort studies to the newer genetic analyses. It's not one bad breakfast that raises your risk. It's the pattern, day after day, year after year, of asking your body to handle that morning surge on an empty stomach. And it's the pattern, reversed, that brings the risk back down over time. It's also worth remembering that stroke risk builds gradually, quietly, over years of small daily choices, which is exactly why a habit as ordinary as breakfast can carry this much weight in the research. There's no single dramatic moment where the damage happens. It's the accumulation of hundreds of unsupported mornings, each one adding a small amount of stress to blood vessels that are already working harder than they used to. 2 types of stroke and why this research focused on both. It's worth pausing here to explain something that often gets glossed over in health headlines, because it actually changes how you should think about this risk. There isn't just one kind of stroke. Broadly speaking, researchers separate strokes into 2 categories. The first is ischemic stroke, where a blood vessel supplying the brain gets blocked, usually by a clot, cutting off blood flow to part of the brain. The second is hemorrhagic stroke, where a blood vessel actually ruptures and bleeds into or around the brain tissue. These 2 types have different causes, different warning signs, and different long-term outlooks, which is exactly why it mattered so much that the Osaka research team looked at both separately instead of lumping every stroke into one number. What they found was that the breakfast skipping connection wasn't spread evenly across both types. It was concentrated much more heavily in hemorrhagic stroke, the type directly tied to that morning blood pressure surge we talked about earlier. This lines up perfectly with the underlying biology. A sudden, poorly controlled spike in blood pressure is far more likely to cause a blood vessel to rupture than it is to directly cause a clot. So when the researchers say the risk for cerebral hemorrhage specifically was 36% higher among breakfast skippers, that's not a random side finding. It's the number that lines up exactly with the mechanism they believe is driving all of this. This is also part of why doctors take morning blood pressure control so seriously with older patients. It isn't just about the average blood pressure reading you get at a checkup. It's about how sharply that number moves first thing in the morning, and skipping breakfast is one of the most common, and most fixable, contributors to that sharp morning movement. There's another layer to this worth mentioning. Many people over 60 are already managing blood pressure with medication, and morning is often when those medications are taken. Food can affect how steadily some medications are absorbed, and a stable morning routine, eating around the same time, taking medication around the same time, tends to support more consistent blood pressure control throughout the day. This isn't a reason to change any medication schedule on your own, but it's one more reason a consistent breakfast habit tends to pair naturally with better overall blood pressure management, which is exactly the outcome all of this research is pointing toward. Recognizing the warning signs. Since we're already talking about stroke risk, I want to spend a moment on something every person watching this should have memorized, because knowing this can be the difference between a full recovery and permanent damage. Medical organizations widely teach a simple way to recognize the warning signs of a stroke, using the acronym FAST. F is for face. Ask the person to smile and watch for one side of the face drooping or feeling numb. I is for arms. Ask them to raise both arms and watch for one arm drifting downward or feeling weak. S is for speech. Listen for slurred words or speech that suddenly sounds strange or difficult to understand. And T is for time, because if you notice any of these signs, the single most important thing to do is call emergency services immediately. With stroke, treatment windows are measured in minutes and hours, not days, and getting help fast genuinely changes outcomes. I'm not sharing this to scare you. I'm sharing it because this channel is about giving you real, usable information, and knowing these 4 signs cost you nothing to remember but could matter enormously one day, either for yourself or for someone you love. It genuinely takes less than 30 seconds to run through the fast check, and it's the kind of thing that's worth mentioning to your spouse, your siblings, or your adult children too, so more than one person in your life knows what to look for. So here's what I want you to take away from today. If you've been in the habit of skipping breakfast, especially if you're past 60, this is genuinely one of the simplest, cheapest, most well-documented changes you can make, and the research behind it comes from some of the largest, longest-running cardiovascular studies out there. Tomorrow morning, before you do anything else, I want you to eat something, even something small. It genuinely doesn't need to be complicated, within an hour of waking up. And I want you to come back here and tell me how it went. Comment below and let me know what you ended up eating for breakfast tomorrow, and if you know someone, a parent, a spouse, a friend, who always skips breakfast, tag them in the comments right now. This is exactly the kind of video that could genuinely change their morning routine, and maybe a lot more than that. If this video gave you something worth knowing, hit subscribe because every week we go straight to the research on the everyday habits that quietly affect how well we age. I'll see you in the next one.